I mean, the US is a $19 trillion economy. It's an integrated market. China is a $12 trillion economy. They can scale things up easily, and they also have the ability to put policies behind such a breakthrough that allows these things to happen. Now, what that gives you is a couple of companies taking the lead. We just put Google and State Grid of China in here. That's just placeholders. But in the end, you get a couple of companies taking the lead on low carbon tech, and they scale up, which is not problematic, or wouldn't be problematic if you lived in a world of Ricardo. But so global markets scale up things and all the rest of it. The problem is this scenario is not necessarily based on Ricardo. It's a little bit more Colbertist, if you want. So states have an interest in retaining their competitive edge in technology, making the most out of it in terms of value, and keeping stuff, notably parts of the value chain, back home, which means you get a scenario in which the technology leaders start gathering like-minded countries around them, and with a gravitational pull, so the world fractures into two camps led by those tech leaders, and they start competing. They start competing on all the things that that have just been mentioned already: earth materials, access to low carbon technology and know-how, and all the rest of it, which gets you a renewables race among those two blocks. It helps climate change because you scale up massively, but not all regions profit. A big question mark, for instance, was Europe. It's an $18 trillion economy, but it's not as integrated as the US in terms of market, and they also cannot kind of come up with stringent policies on the Brussels level. It's all very scattered. So. But the most important nations that might actually fall through the cracks, if you will, are the ones that are excluded from advanced technology know-how. So what you get is a scenario that gives you energy transition, but it gives you a lot more conflict compared to the first one. You get tensions because of an uneven transition unfolding across the world, particularly with a view to developing nations. You might come close to a cold tech war, or tech cold war, clean tech cold war type of situation, and it's not good news for oil producers because they see hard times, and some of them might falter. Now, one of the drivers that has been mentioned before is domestic politics, and particularly the idea that the world has become less cooperative in recent years. And one of the reasons why that is because we still see a surge in populist elites around the globe. So one of the scenarios, the third one, talks about just that. If a drive for nationalist policies is the main driver, then in the end what you get is a scenario where renewables might just not come through and fossils stay in. Why is this? Well, because, as a good populist, you put in nation-first policies. You try and ring-fence your industry. You think about self-sufficiency, and that means you start thinking about fossil fuels and developing them, plus renewables to the extent that you can do it. Which also means you don't necessarily think about global markets per se. Think about your own countries. You ring-fence your industry and zero-sum logics return, and that in the end gives you a big problem on a global scale, because you don't get the economies of scale that you need in order to develop renewable energy technologies and drive down costs and give them a learning curve. You can't just do that in scattered and fragmented markets. So protectionism kicking in spells bad news for low carbon tech deployment and the learning curve, which makes a whole bunch of fossil fuel producers panic and pump in an uncertain environment. And the global frameworks that we know or that we rely on these days, including the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and all these kind of things, come under severe pressure and falter. So in the end, what you get within essentially the next 15 years or so is climate change starting to act as a stress amplifier. You get conflicts not necessarily arising over technology and stuff like that, but the effects of unmitigated climate change, water, other resources, and that kind of stuff. A final scenario is one that I would call the business as usual scenario. We call it muddling on. Because there's a lot of stuff going on already. Cost aggression, we've learned about this morning, steep learning curves in certain industries, and these will not go away in terms of low carbon tech. But they will also not be enough to drive fossils out of the system. So what you get is, yes, still declining unit costs, but that still means that fossil fuels remain dominant. The transition is happening, but it is too slow to meet the Paris Agreement. At the same time, it's too fast for some of the fossil fuel countries to adapt and the producer states to adapt. And because you don't have that global consensus on giving some of the producer states a soft landing, they start competing on exports that might be shrinking. So we have non-cooperative behavior on their end as well, which might actually put a lot of pressure on some of the NOCs, giving you some headaches in producer economies, including the MENA region, which for Europe is important, but also in Russia and other producer countries that might actually have hard times keeping the social contract intact. And on the policy end, essentially the world starts to fragment. So what you get is, China pushing for the energy transition based on clean air imperatives and other types of things, whereas Europe will probably try and kind of go for like-minded partnerships. The US, in that scenario, stays pretty much on the sidelines. So what you get is, because of that scattered environment, is some regions profiting from some of the learning curves that still exist and that you still have, but inequality is rising in that scenario as well, because not all of the countries in the world profit from it, which means you get more north-south problems than you have at the moment, and you got energy clubs. Now, as I said, these are not likely, but at least plausible scenarios. And the most important thing is that they tell you something about the international system. And because we're talking geopolitics here, the geopolitics of renewables, essentially it's worth thinking about that for a second. So what you got, just to walk you through the international political architecture, and okay, La Pub, that's part of what we just published this morning. What you get is, in a big Green Deal in the sky scenario, if you will, you get a world essentially being based on multilateralism. Whereas if you go for dirty nationalism, that's zero-sum, that's anarchy. Tech breakthrough is a lot better than the above, or than dirty nationalism, but still there's a very strong regional hegemonic component to it. And the business as usual is a scenario that gives you clubs. So in terms of geopolitics, you think about all of those, where essentially there's only one scenario that gives you a really positive outcome, and that's the big Green Deal scenario, and which is one, as we've heard, that might be very, very hard to achieve. A final slide, and then I finish. What are the takeaways from all of this? I mean, in the end, this was commissioned by the German government, and so you want to think about, so what? I think we thought there's a couple of things coming out of this. The first is, in the end, well, let's not be naive. And I think that has been talked about already before. So a zero carbon world does not do away with zero-sum games. It just produces different ones. If it is the race for what's left now, even if that's what's left is a lot, then the race in the future will be about technology, finance, and these kind of things in low carbon tech. Don't necessarily think about the global energy transition as something that is about win-win. And the pace of change matters. I mean, in the end, you need to think about countries that might have hard times to adapt. The faster you go, unless you give them a soft landing, the more likely it is they find it hard to keep the social contract intact, and that's particularly oil producers. And some pathways may not be politically palatable to all. What do I mean by that? Well, in the end, our way of thinking about the energy transition technology, upscaling, and all the rest of it is based on markets. Markets being at the forefront of things, and we've heard this morning as well. But the China story tells you a completely different thing. It tells you that you can actually, have a technology breakthrough without having, the market economy in place. So you don't necessarily need all that liberal baggage coming with the energy transition that we really think we need, and that might be something worth thinking about. So finally, it simply means that we need to think about not only the winners, and someone said that already, but also about the losers. We need to prepare for it. We don't necessarily should be staring at the net zero target. We need to think about the pathway. How do we get there? What might happen on the way? And for that, we probably need to think a little bit about past transitions and other transitions. I mean, let's be clear about this. This is not the first transition we have been through. I mean, and not the first energy transition at first place, but we've also seen a lot of other transitions from plant to market, from authoritarian regimes to democracy, and a whole bunch of other things. Why not go there and draw lessons from it? Because they might help us master that challenge going forward. So thank you very much.
Oh, thanks to you all. As primarily an academic audience, you'll know how difficult it was for us to time the launch of a published paper with a conference panel. I'll note that 2 weeks prior, we got a paper on stranded assets rejected from the IAEE, which would have been nice also to have at this one. So that, I think, an extraordinary group and extraordinary insights onto geopolitics and how this energy future might play out. So we have about 20-25 minutes, and I was hoping we could start to form the queue and take some questions and answers, if it's okay with all of you. Okay, so the queue, I guess, is right here at the standing mic, and please, if you could just tell us your name and affiliation, that would be great.
Thank you. Mark Finley with Rice University. I'd like to thank all the panelists for a really thought-provoking conversation. Two questions, I guess. One, if I may. One is, there is an international infrastructure around security for oil. And I'd be interested in the panelists' thoughts about where that history and experience, as Andreas mentioned, might be relevant, might not be for the energy transition. And the second question is, there was a lot of talk among all the panelists about, who the obvious losers would be, the resource, the current fossil fuel resource holders. What are you hearing from them right now? What are they saying and doing and thinking? Thank you.
How about if we collect 2 questions at a time, and then we'll respond to them, so please.
Hi, I'm Elaine Ulrich. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy with the Solar Office. So I've recently been doing a fair amount of work in Puerto Rico, which is in the midst of a pretty significant energy transition. And I think part of what stands out to me there is that so many of the issues that other Caribbean nations, other nations overall are facing often have to do with institutional capacity, ability to just follow through on they have ambitious goals, they potentially have access to some capital, they just don't have the skills. And so I'm just curious, in terms of talking about what some of those other solutions might be, or some of this might not be specifically about energy policy, but again, more about political capabilities and institutional capabilities. If you all have any thoughts on complementary supportive measures. There's been some discussion here about having adequate finance for soft landings, but again, who would be the institutions that would, the organizations that would come in to help support that institutional capacity building to help with this massive change?
Great, thank you. How about we start, I did that for a purpose. How about we start over your side, Eirik, and just move this way to see if you'd like to handle any of those questions as they came.
Yeah, I'll, being the first one, I get the privilege to pick. So, no, I guess relative to what are the losers, the potential losers saying here, I think also one of the challenges, of course, that the current situation that many of the existing oil and gas exporters are in is not only related to focusing on the potential need to change their economies by 2050. They have a lot of legitimate, urgent issues that they have to handle, security-wise and whatnot. In addition to looking at the potential for changes in the value of their assets. If I were to guess, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but first of all, there's a serious concern about the need also to change their own economies in the same direction. Some of these countries, in particular in the Middle East, are the ones that are most exposed to the immediate consequences of climate change as well. They have massive population increases, so they would be worried about their net exports of oil and gas anyway. So changing the domestic energy mix is also something that they would have to look at and would be looking at. At the same time, I think they would also realize that, as what Amy said and what you see in the sky scenario, what we have in our well below 2 degree scenario as well, is that any kind of serious forecast for oil and gas demand shows a trajectory that is much lower, has a much lower rate of decline than that of indigenous supply if we were to stop doing anything at the moment. So what they see also is that there is a room for continued deliveries of supply, in particular the low-cost types of supply, which would put them in a competitively relatively good position if you look 10 years down the road, even if the world were to go in that direction. So I would guess that they would look at there's still some assets to be had, and it's not all going to be stranded. And by the way, we got to remember that there's going to be remaining a lot of oil and gas in the ground after we're done with oil and gas. So that doesn't mean it's stranded assets. They have to become assets before they become stranded, right?
Maybe two things, and possibly moving away a little bit from the oil producers. One of a group of countries that are among the possible losers of the energy transition are countries that don't necessarily have access to low carbon tech because they might not be big enough to have enough demand pull, right? Because of political reasons, because they are not considered a prime spot or because, for instance, a high risk premium that doesn't allow them to attract the FDI and the technology coming with it, that might be important and necessary to decarbonize their economies, and for a whole bunch of other reasons, including bad domestic policy choices. Now, why is this important? It's because in a net zero and low carbon world, whatever you produce will need to be produced with a very low carbon footprint or a zero carbon footprint. Now, if you cannot produce at a low carbon footprint, whatever you produce and try and feed into global value chains, you will not be part of the global value chains. So countries that don't have access to low carbon tech might be precisely the countries that fall out of those global value and supply chains going forward, whether they like to decarbonize or not. And that is a big problem because it is most likely the least developing countries that will face that problem. It's not going to be Norway or Germany or the US or the rich global north, and that now includes China. It's going to be the countries that have low per capita GDP and very small markets that are not big enough to pull this off. So I think one of the things we need to really, really think carefully about is how we avoid creating this kind of, two-tier society, global society in an energy transition, trying to do the right thing, saving the climate and trying to prevent the world from getting burned. And with that, maybe a very quick second point only. I think one of the things that will be crucial for that is low carbon tech partnerships and stuff like that. Initiatives that bring technology from A to B. If the market doesn't do it. So what we did is we mapped all existing low carbon tech partnerships on the planet, initiatives and partnerships, and tried to find out what they actually transfer. Is it only technology, so the hardware, or do they actually also kind of transfer things like know-how, capacity, and stuff like that, which is a lot more important than the hardware itself? And the answer is only very few do that. I mean, it's about 25% roughly. All the rest is all about getting solar panels from A to B and stuff like that, which the market might do at some point on its own. So I think one of the things we really need to do is to think about partnerships and initiatives that take care of all the three streams, if you will, of technology transfer. So it is about technology itself, it's about the capacity, and it's about the know-how to build up domestic absorptive capacity in countries that have hard times developing low carbon tech on their own and getting it into the country. Thank you.
So let me take on Mark's security apparatus question, because no one's answered that yet. I think if you look at events of the last few weeks, you can see that our current security apparatus, which involves big ships and big military mobilization, is failing. And it might not be failing if there's a world war or something that's more severe, but from the point of view of the security apparatus of protecting the flow of oil, or however you want to describe that traditional function, it's actually not worked. So because we have both asymmetric attacks on facilities that are coming with the kind of equipment or methodology that can't really be addressed by a big naval vessel. We have missile systems and so forth, but ultimately, it's like put your finger in the dike. If we put a THAAD system over a particular facility, then there might be a cyber attack in a different location. If we put a lot of emphasis on cyber protection in a particular location, then you could just have rockets coming in from a third or fourth location. So the theater in which you're acting in is much bigger. And I think Americans are overly confident that that theater does not involve our own country. But if you think about asymmetric warfare, that is probably incorrect. Just to bring up an unpleasant thing, you can take, and that gets me to my second point, one of the things that we need to do is think about climate change in relationship to homeland security, and also climate change in relationship to protecting the Middle East and our allies and people in other locations. And because we're not mobilizing on that rapidly, I'm not saying that the Pentagon and the military isn't looking at it, because they are, but because we're not thinking about how we would use force protection efficiently in those cases, believe it or not, there's a group that's done a study about whether a terrorist group or a national government could utilize an existing wildfire to provide even more damage in a location, for example. So the kind of challenges that we might see from climate change and the weaponization of those kinds of threats is something that I don't think we've given enough thought to, and needs to be a high emphasis moving forward. And then we have just, if you think about all the social protests around the world, I wrote a paper on this in 1996, so I guess it's timely again, about how our traditional international security apparatus does not help us assist when the threats to energy trade are from internal social unrest and problems inside a society. So that's the answer to your first question. Just very, very briefly to elaborate on Erik's excellent points about national oil companies and what their strategies are. Among Saudi Aramco, KPC, ADNOC, but especially around Saudi Aramco, there is absolutely a strategy to think about how to win in this long-term game where you're going to have the low-cost oil, but it's not just the low-cost oil. They're making concrete investments to be the lowest carbon oil on the thesis that the European Union might have a border adjustment, and that increasingly, even for natural gas, importers are going to be looking at the sort of low carbon fuel standard of production. You could even imagine petrochemicals going that way, right? I'm going to require my petrochemicals to have a larger and larger bio component or some other component to reduce their carbon emissions LCA, life cycle analysis. So the Saudis, Aramco especially, is highly positioned in that, taking a lot of investment in that direction. And I think that people are thinking creatively about direct air capture and other kinds of very sophisticated technology that could offset their oil, and so that their oil is the oil that remains in the market. And I say this in a group in Colorado, the only state in the United States that requires companies to capture their methane. That if the United States does not understand that even Saudi Aramco is making this a high and intensive priority, then the United States is rolling in the wrong direction in terms of its quote-unquote international position in energy dominance, because we are absolutely moving in the wrong direction. And when it comes to these strategies, and indeed the countries from the Middle East are moving in the right direction.
Oh, well, I think that leaves the institutional capabilities question for me then. I think it doesn't done. I think it indeed is a very good question, but I would say it's not just an issue of emerging economies. It's still also the advanced economies. We're still trying to find a way how the new system really works in market terms, etc. But also how it's to be built effectively. And we do a lot of learning there, but you see with the bidding rounds how fast actually it's learning and how big the scale-up is going to be. And the recent wind report of the IEA has been a very good illustrative, actually, where we're going to head there. But I think, in institutional capacity, I mean, in the olden days, right, the IOCs were very good in doing that. They came into the country, they set up the whole energy system, they built the infrastructure in a sense, but also they built the soft infrastructure around of educating people, bringing back best practices, etc. Now, I don't think that can be repeated anymore in this day of age, because the information is everywhere, there's consultants everywhere, and also just it doesn't feel comfortable in a world where you're too dependent on maybe one per say organization. So, but I think with the access to information and consultancy, that also these emerging economies can learn pretty fast, or actually very fast, and can piggyback on the learning of the advanced economies and bring in really significant gains. And I recently read something of Colombia, how they look now at post their hydrocarbon age, and actually they look, of course, at the oceans, and they see the wind potential, and they see also the pathway to it. And they have, of course, the means to make that work. So, and if countries are too poor, maybe then I think there's a role for United Nations or whatever. There's so much going around now with resourcing that should be possible as well to bring that best practice there. I just like to leave it there. Just two very brief things on the infrastructure and the losers one. I think the repurposing of existing infrastructure, like Amy alluded to, is really key. And again, it shows, right, when you're the sitting incumbent on assets with capital and innovation power in your staff, you can use existing infrastructure to slowly go for maybe using pipelines for CO2 gathering systems instead of other things, or use part of it for hydrogen transportation, like the Netherlands is looking at it. And also these major resource holders have large solar resources. So it all depends, right, if they fear the future or actually they trust the future, right, in themselves. It's like the psychological mindset, right, if you see things opportunity or see things as a threat. Of course, the vested interest, but actually if the vested interest can actually go with the transition, say go large-scale solar and generate hydrogen, and at one stage even be able to export the hydrogen, then actually they do exactly what I think the IOC is dreaming of, right? Moving from a fossil feedstock to a renewable feedstock. So I would like to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That's terrific. We have, why don't we take the three gentlemen who have been getting their exercise for the morning, waiting there. If you can keep your questions fairly brief, that would be terrific.
Sure. Andrew Slaughter with Deloitte. You all talked about geopolitics, the transition from a top-down perspective, governments and international relations, big energy companies. My question is, what's the role of the energy consumer and the public at large, given that our surveys show them increasingly aware of climate risk and justifiably or not, increasingly thinking themselves exposed to extreme weather events like we see in California, like we've seen in Asia? Is there a leverage from the consumer and public at large side?
Hi, Dean Foreman, American Petroleum Institute. I heard really interesting different things about what geopolitics might mean to the production and price environment. On one hand, you're saying from an energy transition standpoint, you need collaboration, and the breakdown in geopolitics or that instability retards the process. But here we are with the world with record supply, demand, and frankly trade of energy, and you have producing nations through backhanded political channels effectively trying to constrain or take each other offline. So Venezuela, sanctions on Iran, even Qatar, right? So how that plays out in the path we're on, and your comment, Amy, about the shale revolution maybe setting us back a decade or so in terms of energy transition. Here we are in the Potential Gas Committee not a few weeks ago, upping its resource estimates for U.S. gas by 20%. So as that plays out, and as Wim and Eirik, as you're looking at your scenarios, it kind of begs a risk management framework of impact and probability, and recognizing if we're building, on average the last few years of 65 gigawatts of new coal globally, what path are we actually on, and how do you map that framework to try to have plausible scenarios that say whether the geopolitical part of it really tends toward higher prices or lower prices as we have today.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the panelists. I'm Travis Atkinson from Purdue University. We heard a lot about the potential sources of conflicts before the transition and the conflicts that could emerge as a result of the transition. And through the question and answer session, we started to get some solutions, and that's where I'd like to put some focus. I think there are like two groups. We have the rich countries and the fear of a loss of political and economic power, and we have poor countries who may be left behind through technological advancements. And I was wondering, to what extent can, one, framing this issue as a national security issue help to drive the change we want and help to mitigate some of that potential conflict? Two, is there a role for economic trade agreements? So there'll be winners, there'll be losers. Could countries who are winning in one area and losing in another come to some trade agreement to help smooth this transition? And for poor countries who could be left behind, could we have more of a dedicated role from the multinational agencies to help direct and offer that buffer to poor countries, whereas the trade agreements, the national security framework be used for the richer countries to help, again, minimize this conflict and help us along this transition period? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so some easy questions. Maybe we can start with Wim this time, and could you each just use this to close out the panel also, so about 2 minutes each. So try to keep it short, and Wim, please.
Yeah, so then let me take the first question on the bottoms-up political storms. I think that's a really good question, because, I mean, when we do scenarios, every time one of my colleagues actually starts, we need a coalition of the willing, are we switch off, right? Because, and they talk about smart policies, smart politics, and I said, can we have smart policies with done politics, which quite often is the case. So something, people just doing things out of their own self-interest and immediate responses of signals, but then still, it goes in the right direction. That's basically what I ask my political colleagues. And it is very, very difficult, because if you actually, we have made normative scenarios nowadays, achieving a goal of Paris, but normally we didn't do that. We actually look at the geopolitical, let's say the political sphere, and say, okay, well, where we go? And if you think about the wave of populism, right, it's not going to help us indeed. It would bring us another pathway. And I think how the population is going to respond, even in a sky world, when they do everything right, all the sacrifices for decade to decade, and still by 2030 the Northwest Arctic Passage will be open in the summer, and in the 2050s it will be also in the winter. And they do all the right things. But the signals they get from the satellites, right, it's maybe not reinforcing, and they still have to do a certain adaptation. But the alternative might be even worse. But really, would you get the bottoms-up grassroots still with you at that stage? A big question mark. I'll give the other questions to you.
Oh, God,
Anyone
okay.
who wants to
All right. Well, I will do the producer geopolitical question. There's a very negative scenario. If it were to become, because right now we're in a very uncertain time, as you know, from looking at all the really interesting scenarios that each of the other presenters have laid out. If you're a national actor, are you sure, which scenario do you have? Are there scenarios in which, if you're Saudi Arabia, you win, so you don't actually have to take action? But if you believe that you were an actor that might lose, and I likened OPEC, or the oil-producing community, the big countries, to a game of musical chairs, the American game of musical chairs, where we used to be adding a chair every time the music stopped. right? And all of a sudden now we're back to the traditional game where we might actually take out a chair and then there are going to be people who aren't going to get a seat and they're going to be out. I describe it in the following way, because Wim correctly mentioned shale. So we're playing a game of musical chairs. We're starting to take out seats. We haven't actually started taking out seats, but say we're imagining we're going to take out seats. There's a couple of shale guys playing the game with a portable soccer chair on their back. And they can put that chair down whenever they want because it's not a reservoir that has to maintain pressure, right? So they can just stick the chair down the second the market gives them the price. And there'll always be an investor there at that moment in time. If you're Iran or you're Russia and you have strong military power, do you just bomb out your competitors so they can't play? You know, you allowed sanctions to go on Venezuela and Iran so they can't play. In other words, while we have these chairs here and we can still use them, do we make sure that we are the only ones who are sitting down in these chairs before we get to the point where there's less chairs? I want to get as much asset out of the ground as I can, so I need to slow each other down. So if you're in a cooperative game with Russia and OPEC Plus, it looked like everybody's playing a cooperative game, and we could all decide. Somebody wrote a really brilliant paper, and I can't think of the author's name off the top of my head, about how what these producing countries really need to do is work out a schedule for make sure that everybody's assets are stranded equally and have a production agreement for investment and production so that there's an equal sharing of the pain of stranded assets, right? But if you're not going to do that, it's in your advantage to use either sanctions or military means to make sure that you are not the one who can't produce right now, that you can produce the most right now. And that, I think, is leading us to a very dangerous outlook in the short term. So anyway, I'll take that one.
Let me take on the consumer question and then possibly the global frameworks question and all of that in 2 minutes. What is it that individuals can do? I mean, we can do a lot, and you know, we can drive cars less and all the rest of it. But I think that the most important thing that we can do is play what good old capitalism allows us to play, which is consumer power. You know, if consumers decide they demand products with lower carbon content, then Walmart and all the big retailers will deliver exactly that. And that means they will start greening the value chains, and we have tremendous ripple effects all the way down to countries that produce the stuff that in the end goes into that value and supply chain. So I think this is going to be tremendously important, a role that consumers have. But consumers might also be feeling the heat very quickly, and some of them are doing that already because of climate. So they have one role pushing for climate change policies through their consumption behavior, but they also feel the impact of climate change. Just think about people living close to coasts and stuff. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't have a house close to the coast, but I don't think I would get an insurance plan for that. Or for the sake of the argument, if, you know, I haven't had a look at my pension plan for a while, but, you know, I'd quite like to know how it does. And if it starts doing badly because of the assets in there not being great anymore and becoming toxic and all the rest of it, it might actually start hitting consumers and individuals directly by their wallet. And I think that's exactly where we need to come in as individuals. But maybe very quickly, because then we can take choices and you know, and shift portfolios and all the rest of it. I think this is, I mean, it's a small bottom-up effect, but it adds up to tremendous market power. Maybe the final thing on the frameworks, well, that's a big question, but I think one of the reasons why it's so important to get COP25 going, and I'm really glad it now happens in Madrid, is because next year we will see we will need to see revised NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So the plans that individual countries need to put forward when it comes to the decarbonization pathways. And what countries have done, developing countries particularly, is they have tied this to help and support on the financial end and on the technology end. So they said, we will not become more ambitious unless the rich world starts helping us. Now, this is very political, and obviously it has been used as a bargaining chip, and they're also not playing fair to some extent. But the point is, we're seeing, you know, some of those dynamics playing out already on the UN level and the UNFCCC and the COP level. And the COP25 will be instrumental in sending the right signal so that, technology transfer and finance and all the rest of it becomes part of that conversation so that the NDCs can be ratcheted up. And I think that's part of the frameworks that I would pay close attention to. Thank you.
Okay, I'll attack all three of them. No, just a quick comment on this, what the role of the consumers, or actually the role of the voters. I think if we're honest about it, we start thinking about that when we're in an extremely northwestern way of thinking, at the top of the need pyramid, and we have the choice of choosing to use less means of transport or fly less or whatever. And we're going to have 1 billion new consumers in Africa by 2050. There's 1 billion there already. And if you ask them about their choices, I'm not sure that they will start thinking about what can I do to lessen the burden in terms of increased CO2 emissions tomorrow. So it's an extreme, but of course it's as role as voters, I think, where we can actually move the needle the quickest. And then ultimately our grandchildren's choices as consumers, and they will be most of them will be in Asia, by the way, by 2050. Then on this, by the way, on where we are at the moment geopolitically, we have a scenario called rivalry. That's where we are. And there we don't have an energy transition. We have massive growth in renewables, but we don't solve the problem. And that's where we are. And the reason we're there is because we have no ability at all to address this enormous common problem, which is to deliver energy with sufficiently low rates of emission. And the fundamental question is, why would we be able to solve that common problem when we don't solve any of the others? What is it that should increase the likelihood of us solving this climate problem? And by the way, the whole notion of talking about losers and winners, we're either all losers or all winners if we solve the problem to some extent. So the whole geopolitical discussion is completely skewed relative to be able to solve this problem. If we're to solve this problem, we will have to solve some of the other global problems, whether that's education, or it's gender equality, or it's poverty, or it's the lack of institutions. Look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and think about how they are connected to energy, all of them. What's the implication of having larger female workforce in many countries of the world? It's higher purchasing power, it's more demand for goods and services requiring energy, it's more work-related transport, etc., etc. Just think about it. And when you ask people in the rest of the world, which is not here in Colorado or in Norway for that matter, climate change is not the problem they point at that's the most urgent to solve, right? So that's the fundamental problem. We have to start solving all the common problems, and we have to do that in the same way. And that makes it more difficult, but also more credible that we actually think about this in the right way. Thanks.
Well, that's a terrific place to end. I'd just like to thank the USAE and the IAE and Marianne and Carol and the rest of the organizing committee. That's an extraordinary panel. I hope you'll agree and show them so in the typical fashion. Thank you.